Welcome to our session on Mozambique, on insurgency in a resource-rich former donor darling. I will have today with me Aslak Orre, who is a researcher at CMI and a political scientist. He has carried out research in Mozambique and Angola, and since the 90s, and has a particular interest and focus on local governance, party states, corruption, and political economy with natural resources, particularly oil, but now in Mozambique, gas as well. I also have with me Helge Rønning, who is a professor emeritus at the Department of Media and Communication at the University of Oslo. He has been a member of the Norwegian Government Commission for Freedom of Expression, Public Service Broadcasting Council, chair of the Committee for Efficiency and Development Policy. And he has interest in media and democracy, freedom of expression, culture and development, the role of liberation movements in Africa, and also the relationship between China and Africa. He's also the widower of a very dear friend of Mozambique, Mette Mast, whom we miss greatly. And he has lived many, many years in Mozambique, so I'm also considering him a very dear friend of Mozambique. Also with us is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen. He's an anthropologist and a professor of social anthropology at the University of Bergen. He is also the director of the Global Program on Inequality, GRIP, which is also located at the University of Bergen. And he has worked for decades in Mozambique. I think you should probably have now a sort of honorary citizenship. And he's interested in violence, war, popular protest, and state formation. Stig Jarle Hansen joins us from NMBU. He's interested in organized crime, religion, politics, and religious terror. And he has worked mostly in the eastern coast of Africa, and also the Arabic Peninsula, Yemen, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And he has authored two books. One is Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and the other is The Horn, Sahel, and Rift Fault Lines in African Jihad. I think we have a very interesting panel today. And I will start with Aslak, and maybe you could talk a little bit about the political economy of Mozambique and which factors actually may have played a role into how we got to this situation of insurgency in the northern Mozambique. And I understand that CMI has just published a paper by Dos Santos, in which he gives 6 scenarios. And perhaps you could also comment a little bit on where are we in these scenarios and what is the scenario that is developing most likely.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction, Carmeliza. And good morning to everybody, and bon dia a todos, all the people who may be out there. So the way I understand, I've been tasked with sort of setting the stage for the discussion that we're going to have over these 2 panels today and next week as well. So yes, I'll take up your challenge and run through some points. And I think that the first thing I wanted to say was that the war in Cabo Delgado can only be understood with 3 points. Firstly, in the context of the general political, economic, and social crisis in Mozambique. Secondly, the particularities of the Cabo Delgado province, they must also be brought out. And thirdly, that no singular factor alone explains the war, and that we are still unsure of the exact explanations. There are international forces, power struggles at the level of domestic politics based in Maputo, and there are local tensions in Cabo Delgado. And all of these were dealt with in the paper by Francisco Almeida dos Santos, who we published not recently, but last year actually. And this summer, exactly 6 months ago. And it needs to be said that this report has now been downloaded 5,000 times and is the most downloaded report of Christian Michelsen Institute this year. So, and I'll briefly explain what it goes on. But let me start again with the Mozambican crisis. Mozambique is currently going through its gravest crisis since the civil war ended in 1991, a political, economic, and social crisis that's been going on at least since 2016, and that is before the start of the war in Cabo Delgado in late 2017. The Mozambican Liberation Front, or the ruling party Frelimo, has ruled Mozambique since independence in 1975, as most listeners are probably aware. However, the first 15 years saw the country ravaged by a terrible and destructive civil war, and Frelimo attempted a radical program of socialist transformation, but its measures were met by opposition, which were fueled by external forces. Peace came in 1992, and out of that, Mozambique came out as a devastated country, donor-dependent, and Mozambique became a donor darling. But Frelimo remained in power, and Renamo, the opposition, was relegated as sort of a most loyal opposition, or most important opposition, yet without much executive powers or resources. And then, however, things started to change in the 2000s, as donor influence waned rapidly. What changed was the discovery and start of a number of extractive industries, such as natural gas in small quantities in the south. Giant coal deposits were extracted in the central provinces, in particular in Tete. And in the north, there was extraction of heavy sands, gold, rubies, tropical timber, and exotic fauna. Now, what happened then was that foreign capital and businessmen rushed to the country with money in hand, driving growth in service industries too. And at that point, around the turn of the century, Frelimo's elite was largely based in Maputo, in the way south of the country, was in a position to link up with international capital in order to get rich quick. As researchers at UNU Wider University asserted, Mozambique is not a case of state capture by a business elite, but the capture of business by a political elite. And this is the topic of which Helge and I wrote extensively in our 2017 report on Mozambique political economy, also available at the CMI pages. Now, right in the midst of the resource boom, everything accelerated once again when giant deposits of natural gas were found offshore Cabo Delgado around 2010. To this date, no gas has been produced, but the construction of land facilities and LNG factory is under construction in northern Cabo Delgado. In what is, if the plans come through, it will be the single largest investments in Africa ever, to the tune of some $50 billion. So this is huge. The French petroleum giant Total is leading development there. So still, the mere discovery of those researchers was a game changer. And even the IMF started talking about Mozambique as becoming rich or as soon to become middle-income country. Then in 2013, the part of the Frelimo elite, probably forces very close to the then previous president Armando Guebuza, teamed up with businessmen in the French Middle Eastern company called Privinvest, and note that name, Privinvest, and corrupt employees in Credit Suisse to borrow about $2 billion. 3 state-owned companies that were linked to the Ministry of Defense, and note also that current President Filipe Nyusi was Minister of Defense at that time. He borrowed the money in the name of the state. And the money largely disappeared, and not least to bribes to the political elite. And this then became the hidden debt scandal, as the state managed to hide the full extent of the scandalous loans until 2016. When it was discovered, donors were outraged, and much aid was pulled out, which set off a chain reaction which reduced Mozambique from high growth to economic crisis in a year. And poverty increased a lot, in particular in the northern provinces such as Cabo Delgado. And this, we might say, creates for a narrative in which the rich political elite, now in cahoots with multinational companies in the south, takes advantage of the natural resources of Cabo Delgado in the north, leaving the population in poverty and neglect. So this is one narrative. So secondly, what are the specificities of Cabo Delgado? It's a province with cultural and ethnical heterogeneity. It's huge. It's the size of Portugal or Ireland. And it's right there in the vicinity of the gas development. Cabo Delgado contains within it lots of ethnicities, linguistic groups, and various religions, in particular in the coastal areas, a strong influence of Islam, which we will hear more about later for sure. And in the interior of the province, a large ethnic group called the Macondes, from which President Nyusi comes, as well as more historical big men of Frelimo, have their roots. They had a special significance during the War for Independence. Frelimo generals and big men have for a while been heavily involved in the extractive industries in Cabo Delgado, such as rubies and gold. And however, also illicit trade in tropical fauna and timber, as well as heroin and other narcotics are huge money makers in Cabo Delgado. So therefore, in the midst of endemic poverty, you have some people who are managing large monies. And for years, violence around these industries have, or quite illicit industries and unregulated industries, they have been building a lot of tension and violence. So yet Islamism has come to Cabo Delgado, that is without doubt, but the debate is still out there. Who are the Islamists? What motivates them? And what do they want? We don't know that for sure yet. It's definitely not a simple general radicalization, but something that occurs among some youth, but they are fomented by external forces for sure. And they're also financed by external forces. So let me then bring this to this introduction to an end with quickly noting the Almeida dos Santos 6 scenarios about the war. Is there a possibility I can just quickly share a screen?
I hope so. Annie, is there a possibility? Can you try? I think you're co-host, so try to just share.
Share screen. Yeah. So are you seeing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so here's a few pictures of the resource boom taking place in Mozambique. Here's the map of Cabo Delgado, and where the resource extraction, where the gas extraction will take place. Here are some of the players involved. The Privinvest owner, Iskandar Safa. There's the French interests and former President Armando Guebuza. This is the cover of Almeida dos Santos' report. And let me just run through the 6 scenarios. You're still seeing the PowerPoint on the screen, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So scenario 1 is an alliance between illicit businesses and armed Islamists. And in a way, it could be posited as an emulation of the successful model of Somalia's Al-Shabaab. The Cabo Delgado, wherein the Cabo Delgado namesake may lack the sufficient embeddedness in the local culture, impregnated over centuries of popular Sufi Islamism. It's not the scenario that Dos Santos holds for the most likely. Scenario 2 is very common in current reporting on the war in Cabo Delgado. It says that insurgents as an extended arm of the ISIS. In this, it would identify the Mozambican insurgents, increasingly well-equipped and trained as perpetrators of jihadist armed action in Cabo Delgado, which pioneers the incorporation of Cabo Delgado into an Islamist-dominated southern flank of the Islamic State. And here, the Islamic State would be considered the owner of the violence. But it's hard to explain how the ragtag insurgents of the first moments of the Islamist onslaught in 2017 then suddenly turned into a well-organized and equipped fighting force, which is also highly familiar with the terrain of Cabo Delgado and able to defeat Russians and on the battleground and so on, Russian mercenaries. So the scenario 3 then is heading towards more local involvement, where Makonde, big men linked to the Frelimo party. It's premised on the observation that many citizens of Cabo Delgado see the province's gas riches as theirs, which need to be defended against the dominance of Southerners. In this scenario, the Makonde elite would be considered the owner of the violence, possibly with the support of private military businesses. However, the fact that Makonde big men are well entrenched in Frelimo's political leadership and benefit from business opportunities in the whole of the country makes this scenario neither as realistic either, says Dos Santos. The scenario 4 is more about ethnicity. It's Islamist-inspired Mwani rebellion versus Frelimo and Makonde domination. I think this, needn't say more about that. The scenario 5 is where Frelimo elite rivalry take place. All claimants to power linked to the previous presidency and versus newcomers' claims. So this scenario represents a kind of military conspiracy supported by external security assistance, such as Eric Prince's companies and his backers in mercenary companies, led by the earlier claimants to long-term power of the Gabuza group. So Dos Santos finds this analysis to be more realistic and likely. And the 6th scenario is simply a partial overlap between the scenarios, just reinforcing how complex the situation is. And I think that I overextended my time, so I'll leave you.
Yes, you did. I will refrain from asking you questions now as I planned, and I'll go straight to Helge Rønning, and that you explain a little bit the role of donors in anticipating this conflict. I mean, donors have been in Mozambique for a long time. As Aslak said, it still is a donor-dependent country. And so how did they manage to anticipate this conflict, and how are they planning to mitigate it? What is their role actually in being in a country that is now plagued with an insurgency?
Well, first of all, there are certain aspects of the donors in Mozambique that I cannot touch upon, as you mentioned my late wife. was stationed as a diplomat in Mozambique 3 times. And in her last posting, she was the ambassador, and there are certain aspects I cannot say anything about. I would like to say, first of all, that based on what I've been reading and hearing, the donors were very surprised at what happened in Cabo Delgado in 2017. I think there was very little inkling among them about the severity of the conflict related to a possible jihad rebellion in Cabo Delgado. I know that the donors that particularly worked in Cabo Delgado and those that I've been familiar with, they worked very much in relation to infrastructure projects in Cabo Delgado, electrification and road construction in a province that was and is very backward and poor. And the thinking behind the donors was that to develop infrastructure would benefit the province, as well as being part of linking the province to the rest of the country. And the infrastructure project, particularly the electrification project, met quite a few problems, partly because it turned out, as has been reported in the evaluations, that the local communities were not able to pay for the electricity that they were supposed to receive. And that in itself made it a very problematic challenge for EDM, the National Electricity Company. And so the infrastructure part is a very important element of the development cooperation between Mozambique and many donors in Cabo Delgado. That's the first aspect. The second aspect I would like to mention is that it has been the usual analysis in many contexts that donors are being treated as being one. And the differences between the different donors are not being emphasized. And I think that's very important to see. The donors is not really a unity. There have different interests, and they have different types of projects. They cooperate with different elements in Mozambique society. They also have different analysis of the situation there. Usually it's the talk of something called the like-minded group, which are the Nordics plus the Netherlands and Canada, and to a certain degree Ireland, and then there are often talked about as the others, and then there are the big ones, the English-speaking countries, DFID from Britain, and of course USA, which is sort of by itself. And then there are the Southern Europeans. And we see these differences between the donors also in relation to what has been happening with the gas, where there are interests, particularly from the Southern European countries in cooperating more directly in relation to the gas exploitation. The Nordic countries, and particularly Norway, has been working very closely with trying to create competence among the Mozambican authorities in their dealings with the gas company, in the negotiations with gas companies, and contributing to more knowledge and more competence when it comes to how to negotiate with big international gas companies and energy companies, partly based on the Norwegian experience by doing so. I think this is an important element to also look at why the donors didn't really foresee what was going to happen in Cabo Delgado. That was because many of them dealt with big infrastructure projects rather than an educational project, which should be mentioned. And Aslak mentioned that Mozambique was a donor darling, particularly at the end of the 20th century in the 1990s. And that is a very important element because when Mozambique came out of the civil war, the international perspective was that let us now try to re-establish the Mozambican state. And that meant that criticism of the Mozambican state became not part of the donor perspective of what was going to happen in Mozambique. Then as Aslak mentioned, during the early part of this century, Mozambique had found a lot of resources, which meant that there were lots of investments coming in, partly based on that there will be money coming out of Mozambique, which also then changed part of the donor perspectives. The donor perspectives then, and this went back to the 1990s, partly under the tutelage of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which led to structural adjustment programs that were very serious for the Mozambique society and the Mozambican state, which also led to them the Mozambican state becoming part of a liberalization, and also, as Joe Hansen has written about, how donors actually contributed to the corruption in the Mozambican state. And there is no doubt about that. This is part of some of the problems. Though it should also be mentioned that among the donors at that time, not all of them followed as closely the IMF and the World Bank pattern. And then thirdly, I would like to mention that, because, as I said, there were differences. A very important part of the programs of a particular like-minded group is that they support not only the state, they also support civil society in Mozambique. And in relation to the war in Cabo Delgado, I do think that the support for civil society initiatives, which actually throw a critical light of what is happening in Cabo Delgado, is very important. That goes for research that tries to find out what's the relationship between the crisis in Cabo Delgado and what has been happening before, particularly in relation to the illicit loans, and also in relation to the steadily increasing dominance of Frelimo when it comes to both business and politics in Mozambique. I think civil society in this context is absolutely essential, and I think that without the foreign support for civil society, it would be very difficult for the civil society at all to cast this critical light on what is happening. I would also like finally to mention that while it is true that the donors tend to be very I wouldn't say afraid, but very reluctant to criticize the Frelimo government, and that's particularly the case when it comes to election results. They do provide support for election observatory, particularly to the Electoral Institute of Sustainable Democracy in Africa and other civil society organizations. And without this support, it would have been impossible to actually also keep the critical light on all the election irregularities that have been happening. When it comes to the reports of elections, they tend to be less critical than there should have been, though it must be mentioned that in the last elections in 2019, the donors, and particularly, for instance, the Commonwealth observers, were quite critical of what was happening in the elections. But donors seem to be caught in a kind of double-bind position where they, on the one hand, feel that there are reasons to criticize, but on the other hand, they feel a sort of, how should I say, need to support the state, otherwise it'll fail completely.
Mm-hmm. I think it was a little bit the position in relation to withdrawing support after the hidden debts scandal.
Could I just say one? The support for the hidden after the hidden debts scandal actually also in this context, we have observed that there are differences between the donors. There were some donors that were started to cast a very critical light on what was happening, also before the IMF and the World Bank started to withdraw from the support within the hidden debts. And there was a discussion among the donors over this before the support was being withdrawn. Norway, among others, withdrew first from the so-called G20 group.
Mm-hmm. For the attendees, they can start sending in their questions or comments. We already have one. I'm not going to read it now. I'm going to go to Bjørn for his presentation. And let me just comment that the surprise that was that you mentioned, Helge, in relation to what happened in Cabo Delgado, even though the donors have been there for a while and they were supporting the infrastructure and Norway and Sweden, particularly electricity, was similar to the uprisings of 2010, 2008 and 2010. They also showed the same surprise. They didn't see it coming. And as a Mozambican, I have said this many times, where are you looking at that you don't see that this is plausible? And I always wonder if there is some leniency, even though donors can be critical and have been critical of the Frelimo leadership, but sometimes there is some perceived leniency, at least from citizens like me. But also I wonder if there is some blind spots that do not allow to see more serious things building up, even though we have had the civil war, which means that we have the potential there and the history. So I will turn to you, Bjørn.
I think that one of the reasons for the lack of focus on both Cabo Delgado and also the uprisings and the very serious demonstrations in 2008 and 2010 was that the focus among the international society was very much on the relationship between Renamo and Frelimo, so that other aspects tended to leave focus. But I mean, that's my interpretation of this.
Yeah, but I think that there needs to be some intelligence about the general temperature of the country in order to focus on.
I quite agree with you there, and I think that the reason why people, the donors might have seen it, but they didn't comment upon it, and that is a problem.
Yeah, to you.
Thank you very much, Carmeliza, and thank you, Anja, and everyone at Bergen Global for organizing this. It's an honor to be invited and an important issue. And I understand we have around 5 minutes each to present, yeah, and so that we will end around 9:30, and there should be some time for questions and comments and discussion as well. Is that right, Carmeliza?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, I'll try to be brief then. So without trying to give you sort of everything you wanted to know about Mozambique in history, but never dare to ask in 5 minutes, I think we should know a few things, so have a few things in the back of our heads. And Aslak have mentioned a few things, and I'll mention a few others. So a first element that we need to be aware of is that as a Portuguese colony, Mozambique was ruled by Portugal until 1975, and that was a form of colonialism that was violent and extractive. Yeah, so this is something we need to keep in the back of our heads when we approach a country like Mozambique. Also, the armed struggle for independence from 1964 to 1975 was, of course, a form of violence, and also involved people as citizen soldiers. Yeah, so again, you see violence being part of the state formation, or the state information, we could say, of Mozambique during that period. That was, of course, led by Frelimo and the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, that later turned into the ruling party. Again, the period from 1970 1976 until around 1986 was also a period characterized by militancy and popular power. This was the heyday of the African socialist experiment in Mozambique. It was also the time of the rise of the one-party state system, which is characterized in Mozambique still. And it was again a period when militancy and popular violence in terms of popular power or popular justice, for instance, was distributed. All right, but I think the most important backdrop for understanding current violence in Mozambique is the period called the Mozambican Civil War. And as many of those listening in or looking in, and there might be some people here that are not Mozambicanists or Mozambican, even to call it a civil war is a bit problematic. Some people call it a post-liberation war. Some people call it a war of destabilization, and thereby pointing to outside forces. Some call it a war of destruction as a comment on what the war was about. Some call it a war of Renamo, that is the opposition guerrilla movement fighting the Mozambican government. Some call it a war of the spirits. So the war was extremely contested and is contested also in research on the civil war. But anyway, the war was extremely destructive. From 1976 to 1992, about 1 million people died. This is, of course, also contested because there is no real overview of how many people died. Around 5 million people were refugees. A few key traits about the civil war. There were foreign hands involved. Aslak mentioned one. I mean, it started out with Rhodesia. On one level, it started out with Rhodesia, with Ian Smith funding Renamo and funding the first groups going into the country in 76, 75. When Rhodesia turned into Zimbabwe in 1980, apartheid South Africa took over a lot of funding and training of Renamo, and they had vested interests in Mozambique and had vested interests in organizing a civil war. However, Renamo was also a popular movement. It was a popular movement organizing especially peasants against the state and its representatives, against the modernist drive of the states. And it was a war that attacked the accomplishments of Frelimo: schools, collective farms, teachers, etc., etc. Thirdly, the civil war was also a war about the control of the population more than control over territory. And here we might also draw some links to what's going on in the north, I think. It was excessively brutal. It related to herding the rural population into camps, and both the Mozambican government and Renamo did that. It was also excessively violent in terms against the civilian populations, in terms of dealing with so-called collaborators. All right, I promised to do this in around 5 minutes, and I think I am at around 5 minutes. I just want to mention two of the features of this historical backdrop that we should be mindful of when we discuss these issues. Firstly, violence has been a part of Mozambican state formation and the way in which opposition has been organized for decades. It should not be surprising for us then that opposition also sometimes assumes a violent form, as also the state does this. You know? So in a sense, violence is also a form of communication and political communication in the Mozambican state formation, you could say. Secondly, Mozambique has been a country that has been meddled with, and Aslak has also referred to this, as has also Helge through speaking about donors. Mozambique has been a country that has been meddled with in various ways throughout its short history. This was the case with the Civil War occurring during the Cold War, not only with apartheid interests in supporting Renamo, for instance, but also with the Soviet Union and the East Bloc and US on the other hand, and other interested parties. And it's a country that's being meddled with right now. Yeah, you have the Chinese as an examples of the new imperial powers that stir the pot. There are also considerable other foreign hands that are operating in Mozambique. They might be gray, opaque, or black in their economies and their dealings. This relates to drugs. It relates to smuggling. It relates to illegal extraction. And it's a site, it's a huge site, Mozambique, for the laundering of money, as the whole Eastern Africa area is, you know, such as in real estate, for instance. So I think both these aspects, the violence and a country that has been meddled with, are key to both understanding the Mozambique's violent history, but also key to understanding some of the aspects of the unrest, both in the north in Cabo Delgado, but also in places like Sofala and Manica, where there are also clashes between people affiliated with remnants of Renamo, for instance. Okay, that's it for me. Try to do it in 5 minutes. Almost managed it.
Thank you, Bjørn. It was quite good. I think it's okay. I think we did need a little bit of introduction, especially for people that might not be so knowledgeable about Mozambique. I would ask you, how surprised were you about what happened and how the situation is developing, being someone who has been reading and studying violence in Mozambique and state violence in Mozambique for such a long time?
Thanks, Carmeliza. About the situation in the north, you mean?
In Cabo Delgado, yes.
Yeah, no, I wasn't surprised at all. I mean, well, I shouldn't say surprised at all, but I was not very surprised. I mean, there has been, as also Helge mentioned, with the uprisings in 2008, 2010, 2012. Also, there were attempts, as there have been lots of clashes during the 80s and 90s and 2000s in various formats in Mozambique. It's unsurprising that a region that experienced itself to be marginalized from the party state in the south is a region and a province that becomes unstable. So I wasn't surprised at all. I mean, you've seen this elsewhere as well in Manica and Sofala. You've seen it in various forms. So it is not surprising. So I think I mean, if we go back to Aslak's 6 scenarios that he presented, to only look at the foreign hand, in a sense, yeah, to see this as foreign Islamist meddling, and that's all there is a road we shouldn't take analytically, or at least it's a difficult point to argue in light of all the other clashes and protests that you've had in Mozambique.
Well, I think this is a very good time to come to one of the comments that we have from Paolo, who will be at the second panel next week, and a good way to introduce Stig, who is going to talk about exactly what happens in terms of the insurgency or in the region, in the Eastern Africa at least. So Paolo's comment is, I have reading. So I have serious misgivings about the 6 scenarios report. I think that it gives way too much credit to conspiracy theory. Scenario 3 about the project on an independent Cabo Delgado by Makonde elders is squarely in the field of conspiracy theory and unsupported by evidence. I understand that this is also a scenario that is considered unlikely. So scenario 4 is by now also unsupported by evidence. It is documented that Makonde and Makua are part of the insurgency. Scenario 5 about Gebuza is also conspirational. We do have a rather clear explanation of how this insurgency emerged, as detailed by the works of Forquilha and others. Forquilha is going to be also next week. Mourir Junot, Bunat, and Shishava. There is by now evidence of ISIS involvement. It is not hard to explain how the ragtag turned into a strong force. It has been documented and explained by people who are in touch with the situation on the ground. Overall, I think that this report, even though the author wrote it in good faith, was not helpful as it fueled conspiracy theory, which is already rife in Mozambique. Yes, discussing politics in Mozambique is discussing conspiracies. So Stig, Jarle, I would really like to ask you, you have been to Mozambique and you have discussed with Forquilha, for example, and yes, the insurgency in Cabo Delgado, and you're specialized in insurgency in general in the Horn of Africa and Eastern Africa, and you have also looked at other insurgencies in Africa. So what is your take on this insurgency? What do you see? You're muted.
Listening to the previous speakers, it's actually quite interesting for me to look at some of the debates that you are having that kind of mirrors the debates that I've been listening to, eavesdropping in other parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Firstly, you had this debate at the start of the jihadist phenomena in Africa about the resilience of the local entities, where you had a lot of people being surprised by the developments. In fact, most of the research community, you could divide the research community into two at a time. One of them was the more alarmist, who said that this was a massive wave coming out of Afghanistan, that we saw a re-establishment of Al-Qaeda, etc., etc. Of course, they were very wrong. But on the other hand, you had what I call the traditionalists, who said that you had the local culture, there were local conflicts that was much more important. You had quite a resilience. And you wouldn't have anything, and it kind of extreme positions, both of them. And what you discovered was that it didn't happen either. You know, you did have outlets, but you did have affiliates, and but they were of a different kinds that we expected. Hence, the second big debate that is still ongoing, that is relevant for Mozambique, and that's the big debate over localists versus globalists when it comes to jihad. Where you have localists, very often area experts, saying that this has local foundations, local grievances, but traditional terrorist experts have a larger propensity to highlight the international links. This has been a very hot debate, especially in West Africa, to the extent that I would like to compare it with the Trump-Biden debate of the American presidential election. So for any of you who want to look into that, you can look into the replies between Alex Turson and Jacob Sen. So it's a very harsh debate. But what we've seen over the years is really some of the things that has been touched upon here. It's rather that we now see that a lot of the dynamics is local, but that the global level can interfere in crucial moments of time. So I might give some examples on that. And for example, in the case of Boko Haram, in general, it's anchored in the northeast of Nigeria. But in 2011, we saw a big money transfer from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb of 100,000 euros. And it's rather proven because we have the documents after Timbuktu was liberated in 2013. So we know that that money transfer has been there. So we know that on crucial moments, the international links interfered, but very often it's local grievances who drives it. But it doesn't mean that the global links are not there. And that's an interesting fact about the sub-Saharan African conflicts, because we don't see outright affiliates of these big organizations that acts like the long arm of these organizations. So it's not fully controlled from the center of Islamic State or indeed Al-Qaeda. What we see is a lot of local anchorage. We see never in the history so far has an African sub-Saharan outfit bothered to attack in the West or in Australia. It's a kind of common thing that shows that the limitations of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda in direct control. But, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't mean that these organizations would not have global agency. First, they are seen in the wider jihadist community. So if Islamic State established themselves inside Mozambique, it will basically be a kind of propaganda victory for them. So it has a propaganda effect that we shouldn't we should keep in mind when we talk about these international links. Secondly, some of these organizations, and I'm not saying that this is going to happen in Mozambique, but they are participating in the global discussion within the jihadist forums, and some of them are rather good at the propaganda. And thirdly, there will be definitively over time, we will see a targeting of Western targets, also aid organizations at the local level. So we kind of see this local dynamics driving it, but we also see that sometimes in an organizational history's life, the international links really matters. And this may be running back to what we see about what's going on, because we do see that the local drivers. We see very often you have rural insecurity, you have lack of security for the individuals, lack of, I would say, service provision, because you have police that sometimes is abusive. At times, they don't manage to stop local violence. At times, they don't want to stop local violence. So sometimes you can see, as for the case in Somalia, you can see actually that locals would like to organize to kind of create themselves safe, so to create some kind of safety. You see tendencies, especially in West Africa, to patrimonial breaks, that there's some kind of shock who upsets patrimonial networks. And you also see what you can see in Mozambique, center-periphery dimensions, where you have a periphery that is kind of left out of center politics. And as I understand the speakers, this is something that we see in Mozambique, but we can see it in northern Mali, we can see it in Burkina Faso, which is another hotspot that is emerging. These variables is kind of common that we should watch. But the thing is, on the top of those, you need some kind of agency in order to transform this into a jihadist conflict. So you need actually the active jihadification, as I call it, of the conflict. Some entrepreneur who's trying to take ownership. And don't get me wrong when I say entrepreneur, it's very easy to see this as an instrumental process, but it might be that those persons actually believe it themselves. Actually, interestingly enough, an element in this entrepreneurship is that you have individuals who travel a lot, have international connections. So you have to do network tracing. And for researchers, that's actually very advanced. It's kind of hard at times. But in order to identify it, you really have to look into the details. And on some stages, it might just be the ideas. But interestingly enough, very often, as remarked by Eric Morier-Guénard, these organizations tend to have roots back in some form of rebellion from younger sheikhs and religious leaders against the older religious elites, very often because they had scholarships in Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. And it doesn't necessarily always turn out into a jihadist organization. But in the case of Boko Haram, it seems like there was this was the case of the Ndemi Mosque. In the case of ADF, you also had this element in Kampala, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and in Kenya, regarding some of the Al-Shabaab affiliates, Al-Hijra. You had the same element, a kind of youth rebellion that started it out. And where you see these entrepreneurs trying to take advantage of the local conflict, trying to internalize the local conflicts, trying to reinterpret them in a kind of jihadist language. And sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, it's actually an easy process, because there is a certain, very often in the West, neglected element in jihadist ideology of addressing grievances, of addressing corruption. So what you've seen for all of the sub-Saharan jihadist organizations is that anti-center rhetoric, anti-corruption rhetoric has been a part of their message. So if you look at early Boko Haram, when it still was legal, that is the case. Shebab always had it, and they still have it. They have crime prevention videos that they circulate, and they have a lot of criticism against government corruption. You can also see Jainim had it in Mali, and in an early stage also the ADF, indeed. So all of the big actors had that. So we can, in other words, talk about a jihadification of some of these conflicts. But it's not the end point. So the whole situation is dynamic. So what you will see then is that the jihadists try to internalize the conflict. Not everybody is trusting them. So it becomes a kind of ongoing dynamic. In some cases, they are more successful than other cases. And then we see that these insurgencies, sorry to say so, it's very negative, I know, but we see that they in general survive. So we don't win fights against jihadists in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't do that. And one of the keys here can be that we actually lack the thinking to address the major issues here. And one of the major issues is possibly when I talked about service provision and security provision in a rural level. As long as you kind of believe that you can fight these organizations just by applying military means and kinetics, then you are actually erroneous, because you won't really protect the local population. You cannot beat them in the local in open combat, because they will usually be allowed to roam the countryside by themselves, and the local population have to integrate with them. And we've seen that over and over again, that the local population either then have to provide recruits, they have to provide wives, etc., etc. Why? Because they want to keep themselves safe. So you have a kind of local embeddedness that starts over time. So you need to provide some kind of local safety and local security. And of course, some of these police forces and security forces, they have a colonial legacy. We in the West haven't emphasized this with providing security for the locals, and it leads to problems. And you see that over and over again. You see so-called big military defeats, and then it's a kind of transformation. A lot of analysts, especially in the private security industry, will say these organizations are defeated, and then they return with a really strong, because they have been left kind of free roaming in the countryside because of nobody really cared about providing security. And I want to do another caution bit here, because I do contest kinetics as a tool to fight this as it currently stands, but I also ask us to show some caution when it comes to development. Why? Because I've seen a lot of these conflicts ending up with an excuse saying that we need the development. And of course we need development, but it's a kind of local, it's a long-term project. And very often the focus on kinetics and developments kind of withdraws the focus of local security and the security of the local population, which I think is essential and often neglected. And then it saddens me to hear these stories out of Mozambique when you see abusive police, abusive state. I know it's traditions for that, but that's actually probably the jihadists' best friend. That's what they need to survive. And that's basically summing up my somewhat macro insights to the Mozambican case.
Yeah, thank you so much. We only have 2 minutes. I think I will extend a little bit, because I want to give opportunity if people in attendance want to ask more questions. We have one more question. I have 3 questions. 2 are directly to Stig, Jarle, and one well, it's a bit more general. So Stig, Jarle, I wanted you to comment a bit on the spillover of the RDC conflict, because this arm of Mozambique is technically linked to that. I want you wrote, I'm not sure if I can say extensively, but profoundly about the issue of territoriality. Part of it is about safety and embeddedness, but part of it is also the different stages of insurgency and how they insert themselves into territory. And what are you seeing in Mozambique? Where is it now? Because the conflict now is it's complicated. It's emotionally complicated. But what is it in terms of territoriality? We have we are going to talk about refugees next week, but or internally displaced people. But the numbers right now is about 1/4 of the population of the province. Has now, in terms of the official numbers we have, has now been displaced. So I would want your comment on it. And then just generally, I know that military solution, and I agree with you, military solution only helps fuel this already burning situation. But a lot of people have been calling for external support, regional support, international support, but Mozambique has been relying on soldiers of fortune. So there is something about that as well. So why this reluctance? It's not a reluctance in engaging in violence, but it's a reluctance in engaging with the regional forces and international forces for support. And then a comment also from the audience, which is, so there were, this is from Sabine, half of the wages of the 20,000 contract workers from Mozambique to the former German Democratic Republic were not paid to these workers, but sent to the Mozambican state, officially to be paid to these workers when they return to the country. However, they never received this money. You will remember that the majority of these workers returned to Pemba, the capital of Cabo Delgado, after 1990, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall. And unification of Germany. In 2000, only the German state started looking into this. Has this had an impact of radicalization in the area? So these are the four questions now in the floor.
Yes. First, what's really interesting is these links to the DRC. And it's interesting in many levels. You know, to a certain extent, we see those links. But the problem with the links is basically the ADF, the status of the Allied Democratic Forces, because we talk about the Shebab of Mozambique and Ansar al-Sunna as a riddle, but the ADF is also one of Africa's big riddles. You know, what we know for sure is that we had several videos coming out of DRC with groups in northern Kivu declaring allegiance to the Islamic State. But what we also know for sure is that the ADF never declared allegiance to the Islamic State. So the ADF hasn't commented upon this. So the question is, how close is this group to the ADF? We also know that we have a court case running in Kenya about money transfers going from Syria and Iraq into Congo. It's kind of fleeing, and of course the studies of ADF is also fleeing, because there's a lot of experts who say that they are weak, but they are managing to hit quite hard. We also have indications that they split up in the civil war and supported different sides without fighting each other, interestingly enough. So it's very hard to state explicitly the dynamics in Congo, and that makes it harder to state explicitly what's going on with the links. So my guess, and that's what it is, it's just a guess, is that you have a subgroup within the ADF who declared some kind of loyalty towards the Islamic State, and thus founding the Central African province of the Islamic State. And that's where we see the links to Mozambique, because we see the Central African province over and over again distributing press statements from Mozambique. And it's not really in Congo, it's not really their habit of publishing press statements that didn't exist, and it shows some kind of detailed knowledge. So why do you have these links? It's a lot of issues here. You know, one is the Islamic State in East Africa. The Somali outfit of the Islamic State is very weak. A second important aspect is the history of the ADF. When during the Mobutu, they were actively encouraged to invest in local businesses, also the timber trade. So there might have been historical investments that pulled them towards Mozambique and create some kind of advantages for them. But definitively, the two Somali actors here are humiliated by this link. You know, for the Shebab, Mozambique was a kind of natural territory for them to be active in the sense that they were active a little bit in Tanzania. You know, their female magazine was published out of Dar es Salaam. Very interesting publication, by the way, with fashions, etc., etc. Fashions and Shebab. I know it's a strange combination, so you had this link, but they didn't managed to capitalize, but you see some kind of ideational links going along the coast also. You had these confiscations of Shebab propaganda materials in the previous past. You have Abu Rogo's, some of his speeches being found, etc., etc. So you have some informal links of the Swahili coast, but it's the press statements coming from the Central African outfit of the Islamic State that are the most interesting. They are taking responsibilities for attack. So it's a lot of fieldwork that needs to be conducted in relations to this. And when we talk about territoriality, I guess in my Rift Sahel Horn book, my warning is to make a sense out of these organizations, because they will change according to their territorial control, their territorial model. And for me, the essence here is the semi-territorial side to it. And I want to kind of nuance my own statement, because I do think that there's an element to with the use of military in relations to solving some of these conflicts, but that is the military and the police as service providers. You know, they have to help the local population in maintaining local security, and that's a long step. Given what Bjørn Enge Bertelsen talked about, you know, for Mozambique it's a long step, but damn, it's a long step for Nigeria. It's a long step for Mali as well. You know, because basically you have these traditions from civil war, state grabbing by a specific elite, and also for some of these countries, a colonial tradition where you saw the police and the army as maintaining control rather than providing services. So it's a long step. But for me, that's very important. And it's the essence of jihadist survival in sub-Saharan Africa is this state of semi-territoriality, where basically you have big military bases caring about beating the jihadists in open battle, but not caring about protecting the civilians. And the irony here is basically that some of this is caused by Western doctrines, because we wanted to protect our forces, so we withdraw from the countryside, we don't provide safety, and we see in these other places, and then the countryside is left alone. And what do you have to do at the local level? You have to integrate with the jihadists. And so that's very bad to a certain. It's actually very bad, and I don't really see any solutions to that. I also want to comment very quickly on the external involvement. What we see, you might want to appreciate the fact that Americans and the French are reluctant to get engaged in Mozambique, because they never win wars against jihadists anyway. So we saw Marc-Antoine de Perloa commenting upon the French effort in West Africa. He called it the French Afghanistan, and you have this term forever wars, and that's really what it is. So when you get the American package, you get the drones, and they usually don't solve any conflicts.
I think here is more SADC, which is the regional force, and then the UN. So these would be the two that have been. So I understand they also can't solve it.
Force, but I would not know them well enough, but I do see the regional forces in West Africa and also in the Horn of Africa. They usually don't manage because they have the same doctrinal problems. Exactly. The same with the UN, as we can see in the Congo. You know, they all fail. We all failed for 20 years of 19 years of fighting African jihadists.
So Mozambique is correct in being reluctant in bringing them in. They should continue with the soldiers of fortune then.
I think what you have to, it's a very hard issue. That's what it is. What you need is some kind of doctrinal change on behalf of all of these forces.
All of them. Yeah. Well, I have here Aslak and Bjørn, who are really want to say something. Aslak first and then Bjørn.
Yes. Paulo Israel raises an important matter here, which is the problem of conspiracy theories, or that some of our explanations for the war may appear as conspiratorial, and of course, to that I wanted to say that firstly, we have some groups that for a long time didn't emit any kind of statements or clear messages about what they wanted and who they were and where they come from and who financed them, etc. You know, the Islamists, the insurgents. And then on the other hand, you have for several years now had almost a media blockade organized, instrumented by the government. So, you know, trying to prevent journalists and researchers to going there and reporting on the things. And, you know, in such a scenario, it's quite natural that you get conspiratorial or speculations that appear to be conspiratorial, where people piece together information from the sources we have. Now, I really want to emphasize that even since Almeida dos Santos published his report, more research, and also before, but a lot of interesting research is coming out on this topic now, and not least from researchers in Mozambique themselves, and we need to, assimilate all that new information and bring it out there to the world, and this needs to be a continuation process. Now, just one thing I wanted to say that may sound conspiratorial, but I hope not. The thing is that we know that there are that somehow or in some way there are very powerful figures within the Mozambican polity who are, if not inviting, then somehow manipulating or even controlling the armed bands roaming in Cabo Delgado. And what we also learned, that's why we emphasize so much the issue of the legitimacy crisis of Frelimo arising from the hidden debt scandal. It showed that there are some elements within the leadership of the country that do not have progress of the country at interest when they're acting, but rather very personal and very cynical motives for taking decisions that have a large impact on the course of the country. And that put together, that means that also something like that could be happening in Cabo Delgado. That's why the government doesn't want to show what's going on there. There's something to hide that can't reach the light of the public. So this is not a conspiracy theory, but there's something being hidden there now.
Bjørn.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Stig, Jarle also, and Helge and Aslak for very interesting interventions. And I also, well, Aslak have of course said some of the things I wanted to say about the situation in the north as well. And I really look forward to Paolo's critical intervention in some days, I guess. I just wanted to add or re-emphasize this point that Stig Jarle brought up as well. I mean, he talked about a global Islamist network or various forms of modalities or a kind of a networked jihadist insurrection in a sense. Yeah, that also affects Mozambique. But there is also a highly secular, at least in one sense, military international network operating in northern Mozambique as well, through all these private military actors that Carmeliza called soldiers of fortune, which I think is a far too romantic phrase. It has this sort of the lone white, very often image of the male going in and being a gun for hire. This is not the case. These are capitalist organizations. They, with Eric Prince, for instance, who ran Blackwater, we also know he's also involved in the north, as are the Russians. We all know that these are part of various forms of violent extraction and violent control of populations, and they are also quite possibly related to the party state in Mozambique. I mean, it would be quite naive, I think, to say that there is no connection. They just provide a service in terms of establishing security. When you look at their track record from elsewhere. So to me, northern Mozambique, with the local discontent, the mobilization around local discontent, the Islamist jihadist intervention and embedding, as Stig Jarle pointed out, into the situation, and these private military actors who also have, of course, state connections to the US, to other countries, is the face of global warfare in 2020. I mean, it's a perfect case.
Helge, you're muted.
Just one final point about the international aspect. I don't think that we should overlook the importance of the gas companies here. The energy companies and their security concerns are absolutely essential in order to understand what's happening there, particularly in relation to the international security companies. As long as the Mozambican state security forces are not able to guarantee the security of the gas companies, they will provide it themselves through the use of international security companies. And I think that the interrelationship between the insurgency and construction of the gas is also one of the real important aspects, and I think that it should be borne in mind, and that also means that, as we talked about the donors, this is not a donor-driven element. This is very, very high and very powerful capitalist forces.
Thank you all. Oh, I just had a question that came in from Paolo. He's thanking for the responses. Of course, ISIS alone cannot explain everything, and of course, it is a mix of local and foreign actors, as Stig Jarle explained. One thing that clearly the Mozambican government is trying to hide, which explains why they don't want people to know about there, is the by now irrefutable evidence of abuse from the army. It started right at the beginning with the shelling of a number of villages near the coast in December 2017, all the way to recent scandals. This is a very interesting conversation that we will continue on the 8th, where we will have Salvador Forquilha from IES, Paul Israel from Western Cape University in South Africa, Anne Bang, who is also in attendance today, Jean Feijó from OMR in Mozambique, Antonio De Lauri, and Liv Tønnesen, both from CMI. And we will discuss a lot of things, and I think we'll certainly go over time. I would like to, I think that we can take up Sabina's question then. I see some similarities with the children of Renamo, the disenfranchised children of Renamo rebels in Manica and Sofala. And how they might also, not necessarily the parents, but the children might be part of the rebellion. I can definitely see some possibilities, and not only of them, but it just adds to grievances on the ground. But I think Paolo will talk about these issues, and Salvador as well, who have been in touch and conducting fieldwork. Thank you so much for your interventions, for your clarifications, and I hope to see all of you who can on the 8th for a continuation of this conversation.